Okay. Um, Today we begin our last section, our last lesson, excuse me, of that chapter, Cold War outside of Europe and the U.S. And we're going to be talking about Latin America. Let's go ahead and do a quick review here of where we were before in our studies of Latin America. We know traditionally Latin America was a land of well, look at Native American land. Really, when we talk about the Native American societies, we know that the Latin American countries were where really the two biggest and most important Native American societies were. In fact, the most advanced Native American society that wasn't around anymore by the time the Europeans came across and started taking all the land, um, was located in Central America. It was the Mayan civilization, very advanced society. Um, so the Europeans come across 1492. Spain really takes over all of what is called Latin America today, and California and Florida and much of the West Coast. But of course, the US will take that from Spain in the 1800s, and everything south of the United States turns into what we call today Latin America. We learned that in the 1800s, the US started to establish dominance over Latin America. The Latin Americans kicked the Spanish and the Portuguese rule out. Portugal, of course, ruled Brazil. And the United States says, let them form their own democracies. We'll protect them. Oh, by the way, we want to be their number one trade partner, and Britain. So this is the direction Latin America goes. They largely provide raw materials, natural resources for the US and for Britain. Minus a slight French incursion during the US Civil War, the Latin American countries are left to kind of run themselves. But as we know, when you're trading with another country, there's a connection there, and you guys both influence each other. Since the US, throughout the 1800s, becomes the largest trade partner in Latin America, the US becomes the largest influence in Latin America. And US companies start moving in, making deals with the Latin American governments. And Latin American governments are happy to take US companies' dollars, but don't really pay much attention to the people. One thing we know about Latin America is that historically speaking, the rich were Spanish blooded, and that the poor, the working class and the poor, were largely descendants of Native Americans. So what we're seeing is the rich descendants of the Spanish who own most of the land making deals with America, enriching themselves, and leaving the poor people who, oh, by the way, are the descendants of Native Americans or mixed with Native American and Spanish blood, poor. They stay poor. And Latin America develops a society where you have kind of a rich 10 to 20% and kind of a poor 80%, varying degrees of poor, right? Not insane abject poverty. You really don't see that kind of poverty in Latin America that you see in other places around the world. But nonetheless, you have 80% of people who make below what we would probably consider to be the poverty line. Only able to afford what they need, not that kind of spending power or middle class that can buy stuff they want along with stuff that they need. And we kind of skipped through the time between World War I and World War II. We're running short on time this year with the COVID year. But we're going to pick up during the Cold War. And we know that for centuries, Latin America's economy was based on sending raw material to the US and Europe. When the US and Europe struggled, it hurt Latin Americans. And when the US and Europe were doing well, buying a lot of stuff, foods, stuff, oil, copper, other natural resources, logging becomes big in Brazil and the Amazon rainforest and in the lungs of the world. They're chopping down those trees to try and make money on wood sales. But during that time period, during European and US economic booms, Latin America does a little better too. In the 60s, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina. Chile, really, a lot of copper mines. Brazil wasn't really logging as much then. They moved in that direction. Coffee and food goods, along with Argentina, is more beef, cattle. They all get repressive governments because the economy, the way it was set up, but was just they weren't making the money. That whether it be connected to European, well, involved in World War II, or if it's just the fact that they kind of missed the Industrial Revolution and it was starting to all catch up to them. They're not doing well. These are three big countries, and all of them get repressive governments where they invite more corporations in, trying desperately to hang on to that money for the upper class. And this allows outside companies, especially US and European countries, to have more influence in Latin America. So it's kind of this perpetuating cycle. And we're going to, like I said earlier, we begin seeing logging in even the rainforest of the Amazon, the largest rainforest on Earth. We all need this rainforest to breathe. If you are concerned with global warming, the rainforests of the Amazon purify more carbon into oxygen than any solar panels can ever do. Of course, it's going to take both. So this makes Latin American countries more dependent on outside countries. In the 70s and the early 80s, we see a borrowing crisis where they start to borrow and their debt goes up. Of course, now they're having to pay a larger of their tax revenue to their debt, which gives less money to do stuff for the people. And in the 80s and 90s, we're going to see a move back from these repressive, oftentimes militaristic governments, literally the military controlling the countries, to more democracies. They realize that the only way that this is going to truly get done is if the people are on board. So they had to move towards democracies. But really the story of this period, the story of the Cold War, is going to be a story of, it's going to be the story of the Cold War. It's going to be capitalism versus democracy. It's versus communism or socialism, excuse me. It's going to be these Latin American countries seeing that they're super rich, we're rolling around in money. Latin America is famous for having these massive, rich cities. And right in the shadows of these rich cities are some of the poorest parts of the world. Think Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Buenos Aires. Really, Sao Paulo, Brazil is the best example of this. And the people see this, and then they hear about these communist ideals where the government is providing people with stuff that they need to survive. And this is going to be an appealing message to some Latin American countries. And we're going to find there's some Latin American countries, out of anger towards capitalism, which really in their country equals foreign multinationals, American companies, European countries, companies coming in, investing in their company, taking land, taking natural resources, and giving the money to the rich, not to the people, are going to look towards socialism. They're going to look towards communism. And this is going to be really the major thing that takes place during the Cold War in Latin America. Not in every Latin American country, but in a lot of Latin American countries, socialist ideas are going to start to take over. And we're going to find that the US, just like it did everywhere else, is going to fight to keep these ideas down. And of course, when there's fighting in your country, it hurts the people who live in that country, oftentimes much more than the big country over here who's fighting in your country.